Tuesday morning at the Minneapolis Justice Courthouse promised to be another bureaucratic routine. But what happened in Courtroom 4B would forever change Judge Harrison Mitchell's perspective on hasty judgments. When a 23-year-old black man entered the courtroom wearing a Minnesota Timberwolves hoodie, no one could imagine that this hearing would go viral on social media and redefine concepts about prejudice, education, and the true meaning of justice. What began as a simple case of supporting a friend transformed into a lesson in humility that would echo far beyond the walls of that courtroom. If you love real stories that show incredible plot twists and inspiring life lessons, subscribe to our channel now. Here you'll find the most surprising stories of overcoming, justice, and moments that changed lives forever. Hit the notification bell and become part of our community that values authentic and transformative stories. Anthony Edwards parked his Range Rover in the Hennepin County Justice Center parking lot, checking the time on his phone. 9:15 in the morning. He had 15 minutes before Marcus's hearing, his childhood friend, who had grown up with him, on the tough streets of Atlanta. Marcus Johnson had moved to Minneapolis 2 years ago, trying to restart his life away from the troubles that haunted him in Georgia. The case was apparently simple. Marcus was being sued civilly for property damage after a traffic accident. The problem was that he couldn't afford a decent lawyer, and the public defender assigned to the case had barely talked to him for 10 minutes. Anthony knew Marcus was innocent. He had seen the security camera footage that proved the other driver had run the red light. Entering the imposing building, Anthony passed through the metal detectors unhurriedly. He wore a gray Timberwolves hoodie, jeans, and Nike sneakers. His casual appearance contrasted with the dark suits of the lawyers circulating through the hallways. Some people recognized him and asked for selfies, but most were too busy with their own cases to pay attention. Courtroom 4B was moderately full when Anthony entered. Marcus was sitting in the front row, visibly nervous, fidgeting with his hands while whispering with his public defender, a middle-aged man who seemed more interested in finishing the case quickly than actually defending him. Anthony sat right behind Marcus, giving him an encouraging pat on the shoulder. "Relax, man. Everything's gonna be all right," Anthony murmured, his calm voice contrasting with the palpable tension in the environment. Judge Harrison Mitchell entered the courtroom with firm steps, his black robe flowing behind him. At 58 years old, Mitchell had a reputation for being strict but fair. He had presided over hundreds of cases throughout his 2 decades in the magistracy, and prided himself on his ability to read people quickly. When his eyes swept the room, they briefly stopped at Anthony, mentally registering another young man who was probably there for legal troubles. Case number 2024-CV8847, Johnson v. Peterson, announced the clerk. Marcus stood up along with his lawyer, and on the other side of the room, Peterson's attorney, a man in an expensive suit, organized his papers with confidence. It was obvious that one side had significantly more resources than the other. While the initial proceedings began, Anthony watched every detail attentively. His mind, trained both on the courts and in classrooms, analyzed the legal nuances unfolding before him. During his years at the University of Georgia, Anthony had done more than just play basketball. He had dedicated himself intensely to his studies, completing not only his marketing degree, but also advanced courses in business and civil law. Peterson's lawyer began his presentation with excessive confidence, alleging that Marcus had been negligent and caused substantial damage to his client's vehicle. He presented photos of the accident and a version of facts that painted Marcus as an irresponsible driver who had disrespected traffic laws. Anthony frowned. He knew that version was completely incorrect. Judge Mitchell observed the proceedings with his typical stern expression, but his attention kept drifting to the young man in the Timberwolves hoodie sitting behind the defendant. Something about Anthony's presence bothered him, not because he recognized him, but because he fit a profile the judge had seen countless times. Young black men who ended up in his courtroom, usually on the wrong side of the law. When Marcus's public defender stood to present his case, it became painfully obvious how unprepared he was. The man fumbled through his notes, mispronounced legal terms, and failed to challenge even the most basic inconsistencies in Peterson's testimony. Anthony watched in growing frustration as his friend's chances of a fair defense crumbled with each passing minute. "Your Honor," the public defender said hesitantly, "my client maintains that he was not at fault in this accident. However, we don't have substantial evidence to contradict the plaintiff's claims." Anthony couldn't believe what he was hearing. The security footage clearly showed Peterson running the red light, yet this so-called defender hadn't even mentioned it. He leaned forward, whispering urgently to Marcus, "Did you tell him about the security cameras?" Marcus nodded frantically. "I tried, but he said it would be too complicated to obtain the footage." That's when Anthony realized the system was failing his friend, not through malice, but through sheer incompetence and laziness. He had grown up seeing this pattern in Atlanta. Public defenders overwhelmed with cases, treating each client as just another number to process quickly. Judge Mitchell noticed the whispering behind the defendant and felt his irritation rise. "Is there a problem in the gallery?" he asked sharply, his gaze fixed on Anthony. Anthony stood up respectfully. "Your Honor, I believe there may be crucial evidence that hasn't been properly presented to the court." The judge's expression hardened. Here was exactly what he had expected. Another young man trying to disrupt court proceedings, probably with no understanding of legal protocol. "Young man, unless you're a licensed attorney representing the defendant, I suggest you remain silent or I'll have you removed from my courtroom." The condescending tone wasn't lost on anyone in the room. Several people shifted uncomfortably, sensing the tension building. Anthony felt the familiar sting of being prejudged, something he had experienced throughout his life despite his accomplishments. "I understand, Your Honor," Anthony replied calmly, though his jaw tightened slightly. "However, I believe the defendant's right to adequate representation may be compromised." Judge Mitchell's face flushed red. "Are you questioning this court's ability to ensure fair proceedings? Are you suggesting that a court-appointed attorney is inadequate?" The public defender looked mortified, knowing he was indeed failing his client, but powerless to admit it in open court. Peterson's expensive lawyer smirked, sensing an easy victory as the opposition fell apart. Anthony took a deep breath, drawing on the composure that had served him well during countless high-pressure games. "Your Honor, I'm simply concerned that critical evidence regarding security camera footage from the intersection hasn't been properly investigated or presented." "Security camera footage?" Judge Mitchell scoffed. "And I suppose you're an expert on traffic accident investigations? What's your qualification, young man? Did you stay at a Holiday Inn Express last night?" A few people in the courtroom chuckled at the judge's sarcasm, but Anthony remained composed. He had dealt with dismissive attitudes his entire life: coaches who underestimated him, scouts who questioned his work ethic, commentators who doubted his intelligence. This was just another court, and he knew how to handle pressure. "Actually, Your Honor, I have some relevant experience in legal matters," Anthony said quietly. Judge Mitchell leaned back in his chair, clearly enjoying what he saw as putting an arrogant young man in his place. "Oh, really? And what might that be? Did you watch a few episodes of Law and Order?" The courtroom fell silent. Even Peterson's lawyer stopped smirking, sensing that something was about to shift dramatically. Anthony reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his wallet, extracting a small card. "Your Honor, I completed my Juris Doctor degree from the University of Georgia School of Law last year, specializing in civil litigation and constitutional law. I'm currently studying for the Minnesota bar exam." The silence that followed was deafening. The color drained from Judge Mitchell's face as Anthony's words sank in. The courtroom, which had been filled with scattered murmurs and shuffling papers, fell into complete silence. Even the court reporter stopped typing, her fingers frozen over the keys as she processed what had just been revealed. Anthony walked forward calmly, extending his law degree certification toward the bench. "Your Honor, if I may approach to present my credentials?" Judge Mitchell's hands trembled slightly as he took the document. The official seal of the University of Georgia School of Law gleamed under the courtroom lights, and every word on the diploma confirmed what Anthony had claimed. Not only had he earned his law degree, but his academic record showed he had graduated summa cum laude with a focus on civil rights litigation. This is, the judge stammered, his usual authoritative demeanor cracking like ice under pressure. But Anthony wasn't finished. Your Honor, I should also mention that while completing my law degree, I've been playing professional basketball for the Minnesota Timberwolves. I'm Anthony Edwards. The reaction was immediate and electric. Gasps echoed throughout the courtroom as people suddenly recognized the young man they had dismissed moments earlier. Several spectators pulled out their phones, though they knew recording wasn't allowed. The bailiff, who had been preparing to escort Anthony out just minutes before, now stood frozen in recognition. Peterson's high-priced attorney, who had been confidently shuffling through his papers, suddenly looked like a man who had just realized he was standing in quicksand. His entire strategy had been built on overwhelming an incompetent public defender, not facing off against someone who not only understood the law, but had the resources and determination to fight back. Judge Mitchell set the diploma down with shaking hands. 23 years on the bench, and he had never experienced anything quite like this. The young man he had mocked and threatened to have removed was not only a licensed attorney, but also one of the most recognizable athletes in the city. Mr. Edwards, the judge said, his voice barely above a whisper, I owe you an apology. Anthony nodded respectfully, but remained focused on the task at hand. Your Honor, with respect, what matters most right now is ensuring my friend Marcus Johnson receives the fair representation he deserves. I'd like to request a brief recess to properly examine the evidence in this case. The public defender, thoroughly embarrassed by his own inadequacy, quickly agreed to let Anthony take over the case. Your Honor, I motion to have Mr. Edwards represent the defendant as co-counsel. Marcus turned around, tears of relief streaming down his face. His childhood friend, the same kid who used to shoot hoops with him behind the community center in Atlanta, was about to save him from a legal disaster that could have ruined his life. During the 15-minute recess, Anthony worked with lightning speed. He made 3 phone calls, one to the intersection's traffic management office, another to a private investigator he knew, and a third to the security company that monitored the cameras at that specific corner. His connections in Minneapolis, built through his time with the Timberwolves, proved invaluable. When court reconvened, Anthony stood at the defendant's table with a completely different energy than before. Gone was the casual demeanor of a friend supporting a buddy. In its place stood a sharp legal mind ready for battle. Your Honor, Anthony began, his voice clear and confident, I'd like to present new evidence that will completely exonerate my client and reveal the true circumstances of this accident. He activated a laptop connected to the courtroom's display system. The large screen filled with crisp, high-definition security footage from the intersection where the accident occurred. The timestamp showed the exact date and time of the incident. The footage was damning. Peterson's vehicle clearly ran a red light at considerable speed, while Marcus's car was proceeding legally through the intersection on a green light. The impact occurred entirely within Marcus's legal right-of-way, and Peterson's vehicle showed no signs of attempting to brake before the collision. Peterson's attorney objected frantically. Your Honor, this evidence wasn't disclosed during discovery. Anthony smiled slightly. Your Honor, this evidence was readily available to both parties. The failure to obtain it speaks to the thoroughness of the legal representation, not the admissibility of the evidence itself. Judge Mitchell watched the footage 3 times, each viewing, making Peterson's case weaker and his own earlier behavior more embarrassing. The young man he had dismissed as a troublemaker had just presented the most compelling evidence the court had seen all day. The courtroom atmosphere had completely transformed. What began as a routine civil hearing had evolved into a masterclass in legal advocacy, with Anthony Edwards commanding the room with the same precision he displayed on the basketball court. Judge Mitchell found himself in the unprecedented position of watching a case he thought he understood completely unravel before his eyes. Anthony continued his presentation methodically. Your Honor, I've also obtained the traffic light timing records from the Minneapolis Department of Transportation. He displayed a second document on the screen. These records show that at the time of the accident, the light had been red in Mr. Peterson's direction for a full 4 seconds before impact. Peterson's attorney was scrambling now, frantically whispering with his client, who had grown visibly pale. The confident demeanor both men had maintained throughout the morning had evaporated entirely. Furthermore, Anthony continued, I've secured witness testimony from Miss Sarah Chen, who was waiting at the bus stop on the corner. He gestured to a middle-aged woman who had quietly entered the courtroom during the recess. Miss Chen, would you please tell the court what you observed? The witness stood nervously. I saw the whole thing. The man in the blue car, she pointed toward Peterson, was texting on his phone and never even slowed down for the red light. The other driver, Mr. Johnson, couldn't have done anything to avoid it. Judge Mitchell felt his stomach sink further. Not only had he prejudged Anthony Edwards, but he had been on the verge of allowing a complete miscarriage of justice. The real victim was sitting right there, represented by someone the judge had nearly thrown out of his courtroom. Anthony wasn't finished dismantling the case. Your Honor, I've also obtained Mr. Peterson's phone records, which show he was engaged in active text messaging at the exact time of the accident. This constitutes distracted driving under Minnesota Statute 169-14. The phone records appeared on screen, showing a text conversation that continued right through the timestamp of the accident. Peterson's attorney slumped in his chair, realizing his client had not only lied about the circumstances, but had also withheld crucial evidence. Your Honor, Peterson's attorney said weakly, I'd like to request a recess to consult with my client. Judge Mitchell's voice was stern. Counselor, it appears your client has been less than truthful with this court. Not only was he at fault for this accident, but he's been pursuing a frivolous lawsuit against the actual victim. Anthony seized the moment. Your Honor, given the clear evidence of Mr. Peterson's fault and the frivolous nature of his lawsuit, I'm filing a countersuit for damages to my client's vehicle, medical expenses for injuries sustained, lost wages, and emotional distress. Additionally, I'm requesting sanctions against the plaintiff for bringing a bad faith lawsuit to this court. The irony was thick in the courtroom air. Marcus, who had walked in that morning facing financial ruin from a lawsuit he couldn't afford to fight, was now positioned to receive compensation for damages he had actually suffered. Peterson's attorney made one last desperate attempt. Your Honor, this is highly irregular. Mr. Edwards wasn't even the attorney of record when this case began. Judge Mitchell had heard enough. Counselor, what's irregular is your client's behavior and your failure to properly investigate this case before filing suit. Mr. Edwards has presented more compelling evidence in 30 minutes than you have in months of litigation. Anthony looked directly at Judge Mitchell. Your Honor, I understand that first impressions can be misleading. I've experienced it my entire life. People see a young black man and make assumptions about my education, my character, my capabilities. But justice shouldn't be based on assumptions. It should be based on facts, evidence, and the law. The words hung in the air like a challenge, but not an aggressive one. Anthony's tone remained respectful, even as he delivered what amounted to a gentle but firm rebuke of the judge's earlier behavior. Judge Mitchell felt the weight of the moment. Here was a young man who had every right to be angry, every justification for calling out the court's bias, yet he was handling the situation with grace and professionalism that exceeded many seasoned attorneys. Mr. Edwards, the judge said slowly, you're absolutely right. The court owes both you and Mr. Johnson a sincere apology. Your friend was nearly the victim of a serious injustice, and you've shown this court what real advocacy looks like. Marcus wiped tears from his eyes, overwhelmed by the complete reversal of his fortunes. His childhood friend hadn't just saved him from financial disaster. Anthony had turned him from defendant to plaintiff in one of the most dramatic legal turnarounds anyone in that courtroom had ever witnessed. Judge Mitchell took a deep breath before delivering his ruling, aware that every word would be scrutinized and likely shared far beyond his courtroom. The case that should have been a simple 30-minute hearing had transformed into a profound lesson about prejudice, justice, and the danger of snap judgments. After reviewing all evidence presented, Judge Mitchell announced formally, "This court finds that the plaintiff, Mr. Peterson, was entirely at fault for the accident in question. Not only is his lawsuit dismissed with prejudice, but this court is awarding damages to Mr. Johnson in the amount of $15,000 for vehicle repair, medical expenses, and lost wages." The courtroom erupted in quiet applause, quickly silenced by the bailiff, but the energy was unmistakable. Marcus broke down completely, sobbing with relief as the weight of months of stress and fear lifted from his shoulders. But Judge Mitchell wasn't finished. Furthermore, this court is imposing sanctions on Mr. Peterson and his counsel for pursuing a frivolous lawsuit in bad faith. The filing fees and court costs will be paid by the plaintiff, and I'm referring this matter to the State Bar for review of the attorney's conduct. Peterson's lawyer gathered his papers in shame, his expensive suit no longer a symbol of success, but a costume for his professional humiliation. Peterson himself sat in stunned silence, realizing that his attempt to profit from his own negligence had backfired spectacularly. Anthony helped Marcus to his feet, embracing his friend as cameras outside the courtroom began to capture the story that would soon spread across social media and news outlets nationwide. Judge Mitchell requested that Anthony remain behind as the courtroom cleared. The two men faced each other across the empty chamber, the weight of the morning's events settling between them. "Mr. Edwards," the judge began, his voice heavy with genuine remorse, "I've been on this bench for over 2 decades, and I pride myself on being fair and impartial. Today, I failed spectacularly at both." Anthony nodded respectfully. "Your Honor, we all have unconscious biases. What matters is what we do when we recognize them." "You could have embarrassed me far worse than you did," Judge Mitchell continued. "You could have made this about my prejudice, turned it into a media spectacle about judicial bias. Instead, you focused on justice for your friend. That shows character beyond your years. Growing up where I did, Your Honor, I learned early that how people treat you says more about them than it does about you. My grandmother always told me that excellence speaks louder than anger ever could." Judge Mitchell smiled sadly. "Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman." She was. Lost her to cancer when I was 14 along with my mother. They both taught me that education and dignity are the two things no one can take away from you, no matter what assumptions they make. The judge felt the full weight of his earlier behavior. Here was a young man who had overcome tremendous personal loss, achieved success at the highest levels of both academics and athletics, yet still took time to help a childhood friend navigate the legal system. "Mr. Edwards, I hope you'll consider this court's behavior today as an isolated incident. I also hope you'll continue pursuing law. The legal profession needs advocates like you." Anthony extended his hand to the judge. "Your Honor, everyone deserves a second chance to do better. I respect your willingness to acknowledge what happened here today." As Anthony left the courtroom, Judge Mitchell sat alone with his thoughts. The young man he had dismissed as a potential troublemaker had taught him more about justice, dignity, and professionalism in 2 hours than he had learned in years of legal education. Outside the courthouse, reporters had gathered as word of the unusual case spread. Anthony gave a brief statement emphasizing Marcus's vindication rather than his own role in the proceedings. "Today was about ensuring my friend got the fair representation everyone deserves," he told the cameras. "The legal system works when we make sure it works for everyone." Later that evening, video clips of the hearing began circulating online. Justice for Marcus and Anthony Edwards' lawyer became trending topics, but more importantly, the story sparked conversations about unconscious bias in courtrooms across the country. Marcus, finally able to breathe freely for the first time in months, called Anthony that night. "Man, I don't know how to thank you. You saved my life today." "That's what family does," Anthony replied simply. "Besides, you would have done the same for me." Judge Mitchell went home that night and had a long conversation with his wife about the day's events. The next morning, he began researching unconscious bias training for his court staff and started working on reforms to ensure adequate representation for defendants who couldn't afford private attorneys. Anthony Edwards returned to basketball practice the following day, but his teammates noticed something different about him. He carried himself with an additional layer of confidence. having proven to himself and the world that his identity extended far beyond the basketball court. The story of what happened in Courtroom 4B became a powerful reminder that justice delayed by prejudice is justice denied, and that sometimes the most profound lessons come from the most unexpected teachers. If you were inspired by Anthony's incredible story of standing up for justice and using education to overcome prejudice, make sure you're subscribed to our channel for more amazing real-life stories that will restore your faith in humanity. Hit that like button if you believe everyone deserves fair representation, and share this story with someone who needs to hear that excellence and dignity can triumph over bias and assumptions. What did you think of Judge Mitchell's transformation? Let us know in the comments below, and remember to ring that notification bell so you never miss our latest inspiring content.